If the question is, are organizations awash with psychopaths, let's use that language, then the answer is simply no. But actually, if the question is there an abundance of poor behavior that fits into an array of behaviors that we know sit within, let's say, that dark triad, then the answer is yes.
In these populations, one of the traits that's quite high is impression management. And that's the ability to kind of create an impression. So to kind of consciously affect the way that the other person sees you. The ones who are in a business environment can do that. And that's probably why they're able to do so well, because people don't necessarily see what's underneath. They're able to kind of portray that mask.
Welcome to the Targeted Violence Podcast, which is brought to you by Groundproof Forensic Institute. Now, Groundproof's mission is to make forensic education both practical and rewarding, bridging the gap between science and the challenges of day-to-day practice. For more information, visit www.groundproofforensics.com. Now, in today's episode, we're going to dive into insider threats and problematic behavior and personalities in the workplace. And I'm joined by two guests in today's episode. I'd like to welcome Dr. Belinda Board, who's the founding CEO and chief psychologist at PeopleWise and the chief science officer at the LCAP Group. Now, Belinda is a world-renowned business psychologist and executive coach practitioner, and she's passionate about the power of psychology to transform people and organizations all over the world. Along with Belinda, I'm also joined by Professor Katarina Fritzon, who's a clinical and forensic psychologist and a teaching fellow at the Australian College of Applied Psychologists. Now, Kate has a wealth of academic and teaching experience with a wide range of publications focusing on a breadth of forensic topics such as fire-setting, psychopathy, personality disorders, and many more. Now, prior to moving to Australia, she was an accredited behavioural investigative advisor with the National Crime Faculty in the UK and provided assistance to police investigations involving arsons. Kate and Belinda, welcome to the Targeted Violence Podcast.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Great to be here.
Oh, look, it's a real pleasure to have both of you joining today. Now, we're going to talk about a topic that's a little bit different to what we might usually cover on the show, but still very relevant to our threat assessment professionals and even potentially criminal justice folks. That is around insider threats and bad behaviors in organizations. And just before we sort of dive into the show, I might just run through some of the absolute craziness in some ways that we've seen over the last decade, where millions of dollars have been ripped away from investors, shareholders, and companies by bad actors, basically. And we go all the way back to 2001 with Enron, the energy conglomerate, who basically fell apart. Then we had the bankruptcy of Sunbeam, the failure of Big Five accountancy firm Arthur Andersen, the 2008 global financial crisis, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, Bernie Madoff and his multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme, Elliot Spitzer, who was the governor of New York, and the prostitute scandal, the imprisonment of Computer Associations International Inc. CEO Sanjay Kumar for $1 billion fraud, the incarceration of World.com co-founder Bernard Ebbers for conspiracy and fraud offences, the sensational life of Jordan Belfort, aka the Wolf of Wall Street. Then we've had the conviction of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort in relation to the Russian interference scandal in the 2016 election. We've also had Theranos with Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, who created basically a sort of Ponzi company around blood tests. The conviction of high-profile lawyer Michael Cohen, the sex crimes of movie producer Harvey Weinstein, and then, of course, as we see regularly on day-to-day news, the ongoing issues around Jeffrey Epstein on the child sexual trafficking matters. I mean, as I go through all that, I mean, but for both of you, what are your thoughts and reactions to that? Kate, maybe we start with you first.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a comprehensive list, isn't it, when you put it all together like that? And I think it does sort of make quite a shocking acknowledgement, really, of how these people are kind of operating in you know, what's that? In plain sight, hiding in plain sight. Um, and getting away with, bad behavior. And I think what always surprises me is it's not necessarily that the individual is behaving badly, because we know that people do, but it's the enabling of that by the others around them, and not calling out that bad behavior. And I think that's one of the things that we're sort of trying to do with this research that we've been doing, is kind of develop a set of characteristics that we can help organizations to understand what are you actually looking for.
Belinda,
I
you're obviously hands-on in organisations, and uh, you would see some of these behaviours.
Look, we do, and actually, uh, as you went through that long list, as Kate was saying, on the one hand, it challenges something I was going to say, which is that we know that if the question is, are organizations awash with psychopaths, let's use that language, then the answer is simply no. But actually, if the question is there an abundance of poor behavior that fits into an array of behaviors that we know sit within, let's say, that dark triad, then the answer is yes. And not calling it out is something I'm looking forward to sort of exploring today, because I think that's part of the challenge. I think, as we, if I may, as we started the research, which is, sort of 20 years ago now, I guess from a personal point of view, is that with that sort of clinical and business psychology hat on, and also being a CEO of PeopleWise, I was particularly interested in researching that darker side of leadership, and because most of the emphasis that organizations place is on the brighter side, and that's right, it should be about the strengths of leadership, but we can't do it at the exclusion of understanding that darker side if we're going to understand the real potential of leaders. And I think that's where our journey, Kate, began, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. So, I mean, back in 2005, both of you published, which really was a landmark paper titled Disordered Personalities at Work. And your findings were alarming. They made you put your coffee down and wonder what you just read. Are you able to talk us through that study, Belinda?
Yes, absolutely. So, as I said, I was particularly interested in looking at understanding how much of the behaviors that we see in clinical populations within particularly what we would call personality disorders, but really those dark triad behaviors, how much did they actually exist in other populations? Because that, without getting too technical and sort of a bit too dull there is an argument that says, are these discrete entities, therefore are they categorical, or are they more dimensional? And actually, do they merge imperceptibly into one as you start to compare populations? And so that led us on to the research, which was, super interesting, where we were looking at a psychiatric clinical population, a special hospital population, and then, of course, the leadership business population. And the research was really quite compelling, because what we found was that in 3 of the areas, histrionic, narcissistic, and compulsive, we found that the data did merge imperceptibly into one, and there was a collection of behaviors that you could not differentiate between any of those 3 populations, and particularly the special hospital and the leadership. And that allowed us to start hypothesizing and exploring further around how much of these behaviors do occur in leadership populations within the business world, because that, for me, as I said, as a CEO of PeopleWise, was a key question. And we didn't have a lot of answers back then.
Yeah, I think it's really intriguing about the adaptive nature of some of those traits versus the more pathological nature around. Yes, histrionic potentially sort of gravitates to maybe being a bit more extroverted and attention seeking. Narcissistic, makes you wonder around the boldness or potentially the entitledness, the entitlement that could be there as well. And then obsessiveness, which again, in some ways could be healthy, but then too much rigidity around that is also highly problematic. What were the reactions, Kate, that you both, I guess, observed following the paper? Because I know Belinda said she had some follow up, but was there anything that you found after writing the paper?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of media interest in the topic,
Yeah.
and as you know, Nathan, we've subsequently published some research that's also had ongoing media interest. And I guess what captures that interest is that we've probably all experienced something like this in the workplace. We've all probably worked with difficult people, and so not only the media, but individuals would reach out and tell their stories, and kind of it was almost a sense of relief that we had named something that they were experiencing and that it was a phenomenon that existed outside of their own circumstances. So there was certainly, a lot of that, a lot of contact from people. But the other thing that was kind of gratifying from a academic point of view is that the one of the editors of the journal that we published the paper in reached out to say that we had been the most downloaded article for that year. So obviously people were really interested in that paper.
Yeah. And did you write an op-ed, Belinda, for, was it the New York Times following that?
Yes, in fact, just echoing what Kate was saying. I mean, the interest was phenomenal because I think it was very early on in the debate. It was kind of, Paul Babiak and Robert Hare were kind of doing their thing, and of course, Snakes in Suits came out. But I think it was very early on in setting the tone for the question of, are these discrete behaviors that occur in isolation in clinical populations, or are they absolutely fitting more of a distribution curve? And what we found was that because of all that media interest, I did do an op-ed on the New York Times, uh, uh, being brave and bold. The question was, at the time was John Bolton, which was the Bush nomination, if I recall correctly, for the United Nations. And I wrote a paper that, whilst it didn't come down one side or the other, it certainly left room for inference. But we had a real junket of featuring in everything from Reader's Digest to Newsweek, the Times. We had prisoners reaching out to us. I don't know if you remember, Kate, I actually kept some of those letters and I found them today, asking us to assess them. But also organizations. It was just the beginning of scratching the surface of organizations starting to take an interest in the risk as opposed to the behavior, because I think that's part of the challenge. And I'm sure we'll come on to it, but depending on how an organization views this, if it's just viewed as a behavior and it's rather than on a risk register, then I think the response is very different. But yes, it was a huge interest.
Yeah, that's a really good point around the behavior v the risks, and then also, of course, the intersection and the interaction between both of those. And I do think the language that we've probably seen in more recent years is around the threat that these behaviors can pose to organizations. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in the show. But I mean, your paper was followed, of course, by what now is an extremely well-known book by Robert Hare and Paul Babiak, Snakes in Suits. So you were certainly, you beat them to the punch with your research, but it did really, it started to, when that book came out, it certainly started to capture people's attention. I mean, Belinda, you've spent now a couple of decades since then working with organizations. How much of a challenge is this for them to get their heads around that if we don't screen or understand behaviors or traits, where that can go?
Yeah, no, it's well, it's definitely a real issue, and I think all of the research has demonstrated that. But I would say not in the way it's been sensationalized. To my point earlier, I think, look, after Snakes in Suits, then certainly many organizations and the wider population, I think, became used to the idea of the corporate, psychopath. But I think what became really key was that there was this broader spectrum of more problematic and derailing behaviors that I think organizations became aware of. But I also think um, there's a repeated mismanagement of them. So um, I think the the working population is not bulging with raging psychopaths. But as I said before, I do think there are a range of relatively high risk behaviors and behavior patterns, and I'm not sure they're being addressed as they need to be. And so that means we kind of have to ask ourselves, so also where does the real issue lie? And I think it's about understanding what those clusters of behaviors are. And as Kate already referenced, a lot of our recent research has really been focusing in on looking at what are those clusters of behaviors and helping organizations to understand what they look like so that businesses aren't left to sort of struggle with identifying, that they're given real tools, because I think that um, there's a tendency to look at almost problematic personalities and there it stops, as opposed to looking at, as I said, the risks and what can be done about that.
I want to take a moment to highlight an upcoming event focused on an issue that continues to present serious and evolving risks: stalking. On July 10th, Groundproof Forensic Institute will be hosting the Stalking Symposium, Contemporary Practices for Modern Challenges, bringing together international practitioners and professionals for a full day online event, following the successful in-person symposiums that were held across Australia and New Zealand in 2025. This symposium is designed to connect people working at the front line, in policy, and at the assessment and management levels, recognising that stalking behaviours are adaptive, persistent, and often misunderstood. Topics will include policing stalking, stalking tactics, personality disorders, the effectiveness of stalking laws, threat and risk assessment, and management approaches, all delivered by leading experts from policing, psychology, and academia. By bringing global expertise into one shared space, the aim is to strengthen understanding, collaboration, and inform our responses to stalking. Now let's return to our episode. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Kate, obviously you've been looking at it in the intricate way with your research now. Well, I mean, really it kind of goes all the way back to 2005 when you first started, and you've continued since then. I mean, what are some of the findings that you've found over the years in relation to personalities and even psychopathy traits in business and corporate samples?
So what we've been looking at is basically what are the kinds of behaviors that we can measure, and what sorts of personality characteristics are associated with those behaviors, so that we can kind of try and predict them a little bit, and hopefully put some coaching and leadership and mentoring processes in place to prevent those behaviors from escalating and from causing damage. So some of the behaviors, some of the findings are in relation to counterproductive work behaviors, so actually stealing from organizations, but also some of the more subtle things like, just not showing up on time, or just, working slowly, deliberately not finishing tasks to just cause inconvenience and impediment for others, right through to much more extreme behaviors, bullying, harassment, and like I say, stealing from the organization. So those are some of the, I suppose, more obviously measurable outcomes. But then there's also all the interpersonal stuff, because what we know is that the reason that people with these traits um, perhaps do well in organizations is because they do have some of those more positive personality traits as well. And that's the things like the boldness, the risk taking, being prepared to. I think one of the items on our test is, it wouldn't bother me to make a coworker cry in order to achieve what I want to achieve. So for most people, it would bother them to make someone cry, but for these people, it doesn't, and so they're able to get things done. And I think it was either Kevin Dutton or John Ronson's book that talks about how we need these people in society because they're the ones that are able to take those risks, bomb disposal experts and people who are prepared to go out into war and things like that, and do the things that people without these risk-taking traits aren't willing to do. But one of the maybe more subtle findings, which I think is interesting, is that in these populations, one of the traits that's quite high is impression management. And that's the ability to kind of create an impression. So to kind of consciously affect the way that the other person sees you. And in contrast to people with psychopathic personality traits who are not in the business environment, who don't create positive impressions because they don't really care what people think about them, the ones who are in a business environment can do that. And that's probably why they're able to do so well, because people don't necessarily see what's underneath. They're able to kind of portray that mask.
Yes, it's very different to, a job interview's a lot lower stakes than going to a parole hearing where,
Mhm.
when we've seen the studies around that where, psychopaths are still able to dupe parole officers. But yes, going into a sort of a low stakes job interview where there's a lack of awareness potentially at various levels around certain traits and underlying intentions, it can make it quite easy to get into some organisations. So just going back to what you said, Kate, so we've got counterproductive workplace behaviors, and then we've also got organizational citizenship behaviors. So is it fair in saying that if we were looking at this at a behavioral level, identifying counterproductive workplace behaviors is a good starting point, and potentially for maladaptive folks, we then also might see a lack of organizational citizenship behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. The two do go very much hand in hand. And like I say, some of it can be quite subtle. Turning up late isn't necessarily something that will be noticed on an organizational level until it sort of escalates and leads to something else, like the work just isn't getting done. There's a loss in productivity. Um, but it certainly does cost organizations a lot of money when there's a lot of people like that not doing their work, and then they have to, you know, replace those people or hire new staff. So it's definitely something that's very costly and really worthwhile for organizations to pick up on.
Yeah, I think that's it kind of goes back to what Belinda was saying around the behavior and then the risk piece. And I think about our risk assessment tools that we have even in the forensic setting, and often we're looking at that at a behavioral level and a cognitive level. But for organizations, I would envisage that having behaviors that can be identifiable is really important. And I'm keen to get your thoughts on this, Belinda, because what I've found often in challenges with organizations bringing things together is that it's looked at in isolation. And so often behaviors are not looked at in their entirety. And so we might see a bad behavior here and a bad behavior here, but they're not then linked together. And that, I think, from a risk and a threat perspective, is really important. Do you find that it's often a challenge for organizations to bring those behavioral markers together?
Definitely. Because I think the way that most organizations, look at individuals and look at behaviors, they're looking for pretty significant events in which to qualify the justification of some sort of accountability, which quite often we know is a pretty high threshold in organizations. In other words, a lot of poor behavior is tolerated, and that poor behavior is often tolerated, to Kate's point, because of the positive side of these behaviors that people bring with them. If you look in certain sectors, such as the financial sector, it is well established that within a sector such as that, there are benefits to be had from those that can actually stretch risk-taking to a point where it is more than what the average person would do. But what we have to make sure of is that these people equally have a break and that they don't bet the bank, metaphorically speaking. And again, we know that the kind of the Nick Leeson stories are there. That our history is littered with them. So, and there are always going to be those people. I believe. I don't believe that we're going to stop producing. Society is going to suddenly stop producing these characteristics. But what I do think, therefore, is critical is that organizations have to educate themselves and use the support of experts such as ourselves to really help them understand and think about those derailing behaviors, those patterns, and what is it? What's the approach in a really pragmatic way that I can adopt in order to manage that? So, and as a starting point, if I may, point number one has to be, reframing the derailment. Once you understand what those derailers are, then we can start using language that will stop people getting defensive. We start using things like overused strengths, people showing blind spots under pressure, showing predictable patterns of behavior. We need to, as I said, I am a firm believer that we need to anchor this debate in business and a risk register and not psychology, because I think that it's too easy to dismiss as kind of fluff or soft or rare if we don't actually start looking at, as you do in any board, what are the risks that this business is facing? But we tend not to, certainly in the board work that we do as a business, and we do a lot of it, very rarely do companies say, let's just take a behavioral risk register here. They don't do it.
Mm.
So I think that actually there are very many things that we can do, focusing on early warning signs. I think use real world tools rather than theoretical fads, which I think has happened a lot in this area. So I think, and training managers to recognize early signs. I think there are and that's just 6 things I've mentioned, very specific things that we can do to help organizations educate themselves.
I want to take a quick break in the episode to share why I wrote my new book, Mass Casualty, The Rise of Lone Actors. This book wasn't written to sensationalize violence or glorify offenders. It was written because again and again we see acts of extreme harm explained in often quite simple ways through labels, ideologies, and headlines. And these don't actually help us understand or prevent what's happening. I wrote this book to slow the conversation down, to look carefully at grievances, beliefs, mental health, and the many other pathways that lead individuals towards violence, and importantly, where there are opportunities to intervene. If you work in policing, psychology, policy, or even if you're simply trying to make sense of the ongoing challenges that we keep seeing with mass casualty attacks, then this book is an invitation to think more deeply about a problem that we can't afford to misunderstand. With our wide international audience, the best place to find the book, regardless of the country you're in, is on Amazon. Now let's jump back into the episode. That's a really good point around what they need to do to be better versed in tackling these issues. And I think the behavioral language around it, as you said, it is really quite crucial. I'll run a case by both of you because I think that sometimes is a good way to put it into perspective for our listeners. And many people will be familiar with the case of Theranos, which has recently been in the news with Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. And I love this quote from Susan Crumler, who wrote a piece, and she described Elizabeth Holmes as one of the most fascinating figures of our times, with her turtlenecks, gigantic eye, and weird-ass voice. And I mean, look, I guess the behavioural aspect's really challenging when it's your executives that are in control of the organisation, but it's also, of course, relevant because we'll get people at all different levels. But, in this case, we had Holmes and Balwani who essentially led Theranos, and, people made complaints it was really difficult for employees to be able to do anything about that, because essentially it would just get swept under the rug. And they made a culture where you basically conformed or you left. So you were loyal, and if you didn't have the loyalty, then you weren't wanted in the organization. And in many ways, it was the classic House of Cards scenario, just built on lies and layers of deceit and secrets. And we could spend hours dissecting the case, but Balwani, he was often referred to as the enforcer in the organization, and Holmes as the mastermind. And so they developed this Edison machine, which was that through a pinprick of blood, you could complete hundreds of tests, but the machine never actually worked, and staff were made to fabricate results. Patients were misdiagnosed, and numerous investors that had put millions in were misled. So, and on top of that, it was reported that staff would just disappear. Some were put under surveillance by private investigators. Information was siloed and classified. There was mass surveillance throughout all the facilities. Internal chat ports were blocked, and Holmes was said to have commanded really a religious-like commitment from her employees. So, Kate, I mean, from a research perspective, with counterproductive behaviours and some, the personality traits that you've seen over the years, does this fit into that type of trend and pattern that you've seen in the research?
Yeah, I mean, very much. It's fascinating, isn't it? The thing that caught my attention was that, blocking the communication among the staff so that they couldn't sort of share their perceptions or share their stories. So each individual was treated as a problem and sort of got rid of. But, if people had been able to kind of get together and talk about what was actually going on and share their experiences, it probably would have got to the point where, or it possibly would have got to the point where somebody would have called out that behavior and reported it much earlier than it did get reported. But there's that sort of sense of the person is that, makes the rules, and you just have to toe the line, do what you're told, or else you're out, kind of thing. And, being able to get away with that for so long is quite remarkable, that no one did try and report it. Or if they did, it wasn't listened to. But it does have that, it does have that flavor of, don't want to say narcissism, but not.
You did.
That's the one that really stands out for me, is this kind of, it's my rules, it's my way or the highway. I'm in charge. You do what I say, or you get out.
Yeah, and of course, that's one thing, and then it's another thing to be, running essentially a scam in many aspects that's completely sort of fabricated and built on lies. So you've got multiple different behaviours. I mean, Belinda, obviously Theranos is a massive case, and it's taken years to prosecute. But I mean, do you see sort of any clear lessons and failings that are important for organisations in a case like that?
Definitely. And I absolutely reinforce what Kate was saying. I think it's such a strong case study for us all to learn from. But the first thing I'd say is that, it's not just about the individual. I think you'd be hard pushed to find a case that shows a better example of systemic failure as it unfolded through those layers. And I think if we just take a few of those layers, you start with that charisma, which we've already talked a lot about, but without challenge. And that is a governance problem. That is an organization that doesn't have good governance. And from the board down, they were not equipped to challenge and to bring to bear an accountability. I think the silence that is a feature across the entire case would be anchored probably today most aptly in the idea of Amy Edmondson, that psychological safety, that the sheer absence of contribution doesn't mean there's not a problem. But actually people, I do think, need to think about, why was that psychological safety absent, and why were people happy? It's a casual use of the word, but why did they stay silent? and how much was loyalty weaponized in that in the case, right? Because we know it was. And I think, as I said, for me, we work a lot with boards, and this was a really clear example of where the board um, it didn't have the expertise to understand and was structurally blind to what was going on. So there's some very clear lessons there, I think, for how boards observe their responsibilities and then take accountability for it. And that's like, I think that's something that is a direct result of this. Um, and I think that ultimately organizations need to not just think that it could never happen. I think that a key question organizations have to ask themselves is, what would allow someone like that to succeed here?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good way of reframing it, and it's a good thinking point for a lot of organisations. I mean, I've found, in work over the years that there is an increasing awareness of organisations of these issues. It's how it translates into practice, and I think, Belinda, you just touched on it. Some of it is the oversight and the accountability processes, but are there other aspects that you think are barriers that are blocking the awareness progressing into actual action within organisations to address this?
So if what we mean by barriers, blockages, I think a barrier can be, for example, the pressure to just grow and scale. For example, we have had, I would suggest, since COVID, an ever increasing focus on growth, value accretion. And whilst they are good things, they cannot be done in isolation from the system that is being pressured into achieving those. And so therefore, it cannot be that there is a results obsession to the point where that obsession overrides the ethics to achieve it. And I think that's something that all organizations have to think about again from the top down so that they're very clear around what is the risk that the organization is prepared to take and what are the behaviors that will allow us to achieve that. But equally, how do we hold people to account day to day? And again, I would suggest that the literature is pretty clear in this, as are engagement surveys, that we're not particularly good at holding people to account on a day-to-day basis. I think also there can be a bit of I think a mythology around the the person that comes into an organization that sets themselves apart as the crusader, as the one that is going to save the day. Uh, and we see those in organizations, and it's very seductive for people to gather around those kind of individuals. I'm going to pass over to Kate because I know, Kate, that's an area that you've explored considerably, and the impact that that can have in influencing people, what they do and don't do.
Yeah, I wanted to also pick up on the point that you made about the psychological safety. And I was just thinking about, the psychological safety of people to raise the problems and actually report the bad behavior. Because what we often see happening is that the people who are actually the problem are very good at resourcing themselves, finding out what the legislation says, what protections there are around them, and they will use those protections. They will use the law to to almost turn the problem. It's gaslighting. They end up making the person who raised the problem becomes the scapegoat, and I've seen this in organizations where they end up being the one who is managed out. The person who is raising the problems becomes the target or the scapegoat, and it's easier to get rid of that person or for that person to be bullied out passively than to actually deal with this very loud, very sort of well informed, constantly threatening to sue. Um, who the real person, who, by the way, also happens to be making the company a lot of money. So
Yeah.
it's there. like it's the two sides of the coin. Yes, we recognize that this person is difficult and that, everyone who works with them ends up, raising a claim of bullying or whatever. But, they're also working for us in some ways. Their behaviors are working for us.
And that's a really good point. And I think that, I think those flags are there. I think that's another big barrier, a big blockage. I think early red flags are often visible as they weren't there on us, but they're rationalized. As human beings, we like to rationalize, we like to make sense of things. And so we don't really look for those patterns of behavior. Going back to the earlier point, we see things in isolation. We don't stop and really think about what we're seeing. And so we either dismiss or we rationalize. And actually, what we need to do is train leaders and boards and managers to recognize those patterns of behavior and to recognize that they are clusters that are very recognizable and that they will have dire consequences if you don't act. And I think if we go back to Theranos, I think that because that wasn't just about being dishonest, was it? It was overconfidence, unchecked by governance. It was, as we said, the psychological safety that just collapsed, it just didn't exist. There were a number of very clear signs that went unchecked.
Yeah, look, I mean, both of you have given lots of wonderful input there. I mean, what we're talking about ultimately is the management of these people, because as you say, some of them they're very clever, they're very litigious, and they can be the highly interpersonally skilled, or in contrast, very rigid and sort of dogmatic in the way they go about things, and that makes it incredibly challenging to try and resolve a situation where they think they're in the right. They know how to move the puzzle pieces around to their advantage. They can create doubt, and they can even put themselves as a victim. And I mean, that's a huge issue for organisations. Keen on your thoughts on this, Belinda, but I mean, in some ways, is it better just to pay the person out and move them on?
Gosh, that's controversial. Well, it's a personal opinion here. I can't speak for the corporate world. I can speak it as an employer, and I
Yeah.
can speak as a researcher and as a leader. And I would say absolutely not. I think the fact that we have set those precedents already is most unfortunate. We know the cluster of behaviors that you've just expressed. What I
Yeah.
think we have to do is help from the very beginning, help organizations be far less frightened about the behaviors and lean into understanding and how to hold people accountable, but then also how to shape. You've got two paths to this. We've already said that actually there are some positive aspects to some of these characteristics. So we need to understand what they are. We need to understand what we'll tolerate. We need to also understand how we can help shape and develop people, because many of these things are developable. We need to remember that. But I also think we need to make sure on the assessment side that well before people ever enter organizations, that because of the very description that we've given earlier, where they can be highly seductive at interview, we need to make sure that screenings are in place that identify, and that doesn't mean you necessarily select out, but you know what you're then managing. And that's what's important. So I think there are some things we can do, which is the research obviously we've been doing, and building tools and techniques that give these tools to organizations and give them what they need.
Mm. Yeah, I think that you're certainly not getting them into the organisation is the perfect scenario. I mean, I find the management, though, is incredibly challenging, where you can end up essentially in a standoff with these folks for years, and the costs of doing that and the time that it takes. And then the other side of it is, if it's not managed and resolved, then they often just move them into another position within the organisation, and strangely often they're also promoted, and then it becomes a problem again 18 months down the track. So the management, that's why I sort of threw out there around just getting rid of them, because sometimes I find that organisations are not able to resolve it in an effective way, or spend years trying to resolve it. Uh, and it just continues to sort of cycle and cycle. And, my sort of thoughts is, well, how do you step this person out of the organization so that it, when they have a grievance and a certain personality, that's really difficult. But I think, as you're saying as well, there's a balance there around, you need to go through the process of trying to resolve it. But at some point, it probably does tip into the point that this is actually starting to be detrimental for the well-being, for the safety of our other employees. People are anxious and fearful about coming to work. We're trying to placate this person and meet what they want, but it's coming at a huge cost to our organisation.
And absolutely, and just building on that, if I may, Nathan, I think that gets back to the dimensionality of this problem. It's not an either or, and
Yeah.
therefore it's going to come down to degree. What is the risk that this individual is posing to the organization, to the system? Is the individual in any way showing any signs at all of being amenable to, Kate mentioned before, coaching. There are a number of interventions that one can use to help develop individuals, but are they open to that? Or actually, are they going through the motions? Because if you end up with somebody going through the motions, then absolutely, it's time to part company, because the risk and the wake that they leave is just too great for everybody else. But I don't think it's an either or. But which is why I go back to, I think one of the earlier points, which is, I think organizations need to make sure that they themselves are well equipped to not only manage the risk from point of entry to point of departure, so point of understanding and identifying any of these risks, but also having in place very clear procedures for managing the risks, whether that's a development pathway, whether that's an exit pathway. But it's the do nothing, or the let's rationalize and just pretend it's not happening, let's be blind to it, that I think is really impacting a lot of people today that are part of a system where they're either being bullied, or, just to label a few easy things, being bypassed, etc.
Yeah, I mean, that's great advice and a great way to frame it. And I wanted to go back just to what you said earlier about a lot of organisations and growth since COVID, because I think this is, again, it's probably sort of simmering away beneath the surface, because there has been so much growth for a lot of organisations, and it's been basically desperate just to get bums on seats in roles. And that brings us to sort of the next issue that I really want to talk about, which is that we can't just be putting people in roles without actually understanding the people that we are letting into the organisation. Because if you do the sort of easier work up front, it saves you years of pain and turmoil down the track. And Kate, so about 10 years ago, and I was involved in this research with you, along with Professor Simon Kroom from the University of San Diego, and also Courtney Bailey, who was at Bond University at the time. And that research led to the development of the corporate personality inventory. Are you able to tell us a bit about that assessment?
Yeah, so that's the assessment that we developed, as you said, more than 10 years ago now. And we've done quite a lot of research, and then we've actually developed that further now with Belinda and PeopleWise in her company. And what started off as a reasonably comprehensive personality inventory has now become a shorter kind of screening version, which does make it much easier to use for that early intervention, which we've all been saying is the key here, because we don't want it to get to the point where the person is already quite ingrained in their problematic behavior. We want to try and screen for it, not necessarily to screen out, but as Belinda said, to know what it is that we're dealing with from the beginning. But so we developed this tool. It was based on a number of things. It was based on an expert panel. It was based on, reading the research around personality disorder, including psychopathy, but also the other dark triad traits as well. And what we wanted to do was to develop a set of items that were particularly relevant to the business world. So whereas existing tools had already been developed, we didn't think that they were going to be necessarily applicable because they were asking about antisocial behaviors, which we don't necessarily. We do sometimes see antisocial behaviors in the workplace, but we more commonly see behaviors that we wouldn't necessarily call antisocial, but you used the word incivility before. And then the research has probably tested well over 1,000, maybe even as many as 2,000 individuals now, and looking at a number of different outcome measures, including the counterproductive work behaviors, but also including some some of the more positive things like their leadership style, their number of promotions that they've had within the organization, their salary range, to see whether we can predict those positives as well as the negatives. And then, as I say, where we're up to now is turning that more comprehensive personality measure into something that can be used probably more effectively and efficiently by organizations to reduce it down to a number of key personality characteristics. And then we're just in the process of checking the kind of reliability and validity of that shorter tool now so that we can start using that.
Wonderful. So that's now, I guess, progressed into the derailers profiler through PeopleWise, hasn't it, Belinda? And are you able to talk us through the tool now and how PeopleWise are able to use that to support organisations in hiring staff and also sort of knowing what they're taking on and what they might need to be aware of if they do take on someone with certain personality clusters or trait clusters?
Yeah. And I think, so thank you very much, Nathan. And I think, as Kate said, we've spent a lot of time distilling down into almost like a really rich jus so that it's heavily concentrated, but every item counts and it counts in being able to really understand from a predictive perspective who is more likely to demonstrate the behaviors that are more unhelpful, more counterproductive in the workplace. And we've been able to look at 9 different areas across 9 different sets of derailers. And those 9 different sets of derailers are giving us the very clear data on the risks that one can expect once you've screened that individual. And it's not necessarily, as we've said, a screen out. What it does in using a derailers profiler allow you to build that risk register. And that risk register, it should not be, we have to move away from a personality risk to an operational risk, because it is not about the personality in the person. It is about how that then plays out from an operational point of view. And I believe that whole mindset shift is critical for organizations if they're going to truly start to harness the behavioral risk that comes from having human beings, and particularly, as we know, in demonstrating these edge behaviors. So I think the derailers profiler is, I think, really strong in 3 areas. I think it's very strong in screening out, particularly if the profile is of a particular pattern where one would decide that actually for the particular role, the match is the gap between what is required and the role is too great. So I think there's a screening out. I think there's an education piece where one understands the risks that one is bringing into the business, but it is done with a management and a development lens so that people understand the impact that they're having. For example, it may be that I score high on, let's take egotistic. It's one of the derailers. Now that's a really overpowering at the extreme. If I'm sitting at sort of the 9th or 10th stand, it is an incredibly strong belief in my capabilities and who I am as a human being, and a sense of superiority over others. Now, that can be a rather significant detractor, in terms of ingratiating myself to others. But it can also mean that I kind of ride roughshod over people and I'm almost blind to the talents of others. But if I have a blind spot in that space and I learn through the organization through getting feedback on this derailer, and I'm open to developing, then actually these areas are developable. A key question obviously comes back to what extent is somebody really wanting to shift and develop in that space. So I think what we have now is, as I said, a tool that allows us to educate, it allows us to select out, and allows us to help develop people. And I think those three areas are critical.
No, that's really helpful to understand. And I think as you're saying, you're looking at the outcomes, if I understand that right, and the risks that could be there for the organization around these types of traits rather than this individual in the business. And Kate and I wrote a chapter a few years back now, and one of the things I think we suggested in that chapter was around how people frame up their job advertisements, because you need to know what you're looking for, what the traits, the qualities are in the person that you're looking for, and then does your person match to that? Because from my understanding, there's some challenges often around the legal issues around screening out someone based on their traits. But if you have a profile of the person that you're looking for that is suitable for that role and suitable for the organization or the risk structure of that organization, then you can look for someone that fits within that. Is that fair to say, Belinda?
Yes, I think so. And I think that, I think organizations, as we think about how do organizations begin to make the shift so that they are really engaging with the challenges that we've been talking about, as opposed to treating them as isolated events. I think there's just a couple of really significant things that organizations can do. And I think that organizations, as I said earlier, I think they have to move from that, seeing it as a personality risk, and actually moving it to much more of the kind of operational risk. I think organizations have to build in those behavioral checks, but into the core system, as opposed to when you're just doing an interview as a one-off, as an isolated event. I don't think there should be, and I think if you build into the core system a series of activities that become part of the fabric, as opposed to an event happens, somebody behaves badly, oh, let's pop some coaching on. That's not to diminish coaching. Coaching is a wonderful intervention. But if you build it into the fabric of the system, into the governance of the system, so that, for example, all hiring and promotion decisions actually look at these kinds of things. If we look at leadership assessment under pressure, and we're looking at how that manifests in people. And then I think equipping leaders to act early would be the third thing, so that we don't end up in the situation you described earlier, Nathan, where we end up with a situation where almost you have to exit an individual because it's become intractable. And I think they're the kind of shifts that organizations need to be making, so that you get a real understanding of how to manage and build a business with these opportunities in it, and not just dismissing them.
It's a whole of system approach, isn't it? As you're saying, it's not just an employment approach. It's a whole of system approach to essentially have everything flowing through in a smooth manner, rather than one part of the business doing this and another part doing
Yes.
that. It's all connected. And the other side of it I really like, that in the language that I've mentioned before, is the risk side of it. And also, I've always thought of this around personalities as being an insider threat issue, and I think insider threats really emerge as kind of being a more common thing that we hear in workplaces these days. But it's ultimately a threat or a risk to the organisation, internally, and of course externally as well. And I think when we view it through that way, it does take it away from, yes, personality is part of it, but it's also behavioral as well. But ultimately, it's the risk and the threat to this organisation that could arise from bringing the wrong person in. So therefore, we need to be protecting the organisation and the staff and our reputation to make sure that we're not posing or bringing people in that can, unravel or do damage to the organisation.
And just building on that, Nathan, I would say absolutely. But to see the to see the issue not as kind of a problem personality, but to genuinely see that actually these anomalies, as we've described, are ever present. And therefore, if it's at the extreme where there is a big gap between what the role requires the individual, then one doesn't select in, you select out. However, I guess one of the points that we're saying in our research across all of us has demonstrated is that these are predictable risks. And that in order to manage those predictable risks, we need to design systematically, consistently, and early solutions that allow organizations to flourish.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Moving away from the personality language. And am I right, Kate? I might throw this over to you in that with the derailers profile. There are three sort of core factors around the boldness, the ruthlessness, and the interpersonal dominance. So they are traits. How do we try and then conceptualize that, as Belinda's saying, into understanding the risk? So they might be the things that we pick up, and then what would we be thinking about in terms of that as a risk to the organisation?
So the boldness one is the one that Belinda mentioned before, which is that kind of quite egocentric idea that they're the ones that know the best, and they're not necessarily going to listen to others in the team. So that is going to be something that's going to be quite challenging if that person is working within a team. So in some senses, it might be better if that person was in a role where they were actually having that autonomy and being able to make decisions, as long as those decisions were sound decisions. The ruthlessness is more about perhaps not being able to get along particularly well with people. And so they're probably not going to be very good in a role that requires them to enter into negotiations with, partners of the organization. So again, it's about moving them into positions where they're not those kind of traits of being quite jarring, perhaps interpersonally, that they don't cause too many problems in terms of, external relationships. And the third one, Belinda, you might have to help me with because I.
Yes, so dominance. So,
Yes.
which is the psychopathy. Take it away. Yeah.
So the psychopathic traits, which we're not calling them psychopathic, but we're calling them dominant. Yeah. So that means, again, that they're not really listening to people. So again, it's best not to have them in a team where they have to really be able to work with others and listen to the views of other people. They're going to railroad, they're going to take over, they're going to put people off.
At all costs.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that antagonistic, highly competitive, which again can be really significant derailers. But I guess I'm interested, Nathan, there's a bigger debate here than we're going to solve today around the nature nurture of a trait or a non-trait and characteristics and what's developable and what's not. Certainly in my view is that many of the characteristics that we've been discussing today are in degrees, and there is definitely opportunity to dial up and dial down those features. And we see that in everyday life. Road rage is a wonderful example of where you can have the mild-mannered individual who suddenly behaves in an aberrant way, which of course is why one of the key criteria of this whole discussion is around it should be a consistent pattern of behavior. We're not talking about an isolated event. But it'd be great to hear where you stand on that, Nathan, because as I said, I'm definitely of the view that what we're discussing here is developable, assuming the individual really wants to shift their behaviours. What's your thinking on that?
I think the context and culture in organisations is really interesting. And when we look at cases over the last decades where it has gone wrong. We think about the context, so sometimes it's people in the wrong roles and having access to the wrong things. Then it's combined with the wrong culture within an organization that allows and opens the door to these types of behaviors. And it's that recipe, isn't it? If you've got the wrong person, the wrong context, and then the wrong culture, it's just a flow through where we can probably anticipate where it's going to go. It's kind of like, well, I'll say psychopath, but putting the keys to the safe in front of the psychopath, essentially.
Yeah. And I think, we've seen enough of those behaviors to know that, as you say, if you get the ingredients just right, you will create an environment that can have obviously catastrophic outcomes, which is why one of my 3 criteria is you have to have early interventions, and they have to be systemic, and they have to actually look at the risk, the operational risk, not the personality risk. But the way of detecting early on is through a tool such as we've developed, the derailers profile, which allows you to see very quickly what the risks are, knowing that the research has been very compelling in terms of the criterion of what it's predictive of, be that disciplinary behaviour, poor promotion behaviour, performance disruptions, etc. So it's a really comprehensive tool that is starting to get some really great traction.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way of bringing the derailers profiler into organizational work, to say that this is not just about the individual and their personality. It's about the organization, what the organization operationally needs, and then everyone will have a different profile on the derailers profile, as you say. I won't reveal the secret sauce, but around those sort of 9 risk factors that are there. And how do we tailor the processes within the organization to this person once they enter into the organization, knowing that these risk factors could be a strength if managed the right way, but if not managed the right way, or a lack of appropriate processes, then they could become a significant weakness and an operational risk to the organization. And I think that really what you're saying is, let's get the balance right for our person, if they are the right person, and then have sound processes wrapped around them so that we can have a soft fall if something does happen, or we can walk them through sort of maybe a narrow, a way or narrow role or narrow function within an organization where they could actually be really, really successful for us.
Exactly. And I think in building on that, I think as I said, the real test will be, are organizations ready to intervene in that first pattern, or do they go for the final failure? Do they, are leaders educated and supported to recognize those patterns, and not just think of numbers and delivery? So think of the people, observe the people, hold them to account, because again, accountability is something that, from our experience, is not done particularly well in organizations. And of course, our organizations from board down, ready to slow down just a smidge, doesn't mean that there's not going to be the growth, but just a smidge, to have those discussions, to ask those questions. Not could this person fit in here, but as I said earlier, under what circumstances could this person deliver that type of behavior? And is that stress testing the system?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess if people are listening to this and they are in organizations, would the first question be, if they've got a person that they're having a problem with, would the first question be, what are the operational risks that are currently there for us in how we're dealing with this person?
Yes, I think the very first thing to look at is, what are the outcomes that are occurring as a result of the person's behaviors. So that you're looking at the operational rather than that person is doing something. So look at the outcomes and work back from there. Because if you understand the operational risk, and then you can start to actually expand that wedge to understand how far could that go, because that's another question that we don't ask particularly well. So that you're really starting to, like you would in any business risk, uh, if you think about any risk register, if you're always trying to understand what is the impact going to be, whether it's about your ability to borrow money, what is the risk, it doesn't matter what it is, but you're always able to quantify it. And I don't believe organizations are particularly good, if at all, that they begin to quantify what are the risks, what are the operational risks as a result of those behaviors. And then based on that, we have implemented within the organization a set of processes that allow us to manage that.
Yeah, no, I think that you've framed that again really well, and I mean that it highlights that the tool can be used at the entry point and of
Mm.
course at the issue point as well. So I think that's important for organizations to be aware of, is that the role of assessment, it's fantastic at the beginning, and it really, I don't think we can overemphasize enough how important it is at the beginning. But if you have an issue as well, it's better to try and understand it rather than be making assumptions around it and putting processes and practices in place that might not actually be properly fitting to that person. So again, I think it just emphasizes we need to be really clear on what we're dealing with, who we're dealing with, and then what the response is to match that.
Exactly. And I think that's key, because I think all too often organizations tend to be reactive. So they'll react rather than proactive. So they'll be reactive. There'll be a crisis, a one-off event, and then it's all hands to the pump and we'll react to it. Whereas actually what we're saying is that if you think about, if you're going to embed things into the system, then you're going to embed things like, as I said, hiring and promotion decisions. Particularly in senior roles, you're going to look at, leadership assessment under pressure and how people respond. You're going to look at succession planning. You're going to look at 360 feedback, as opposed to a popularity contest. There are really specific things that organizations can do to manage their system and to manage any of the risk. It's just that they don't tend to do it in a particularly coordinated, systemic way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listening to it, yeah, I can feel that it could become very overwhelming for an organization, but it is a piece at the time. So, yeah, one of the things I guess would be, if you're not screening, should you start screening employees? So that's probably one of the first steps, and then the next stages are looking at what do you have in place for concerns if they do arise. Are you trying to cultivate your culture to supporting the strengths and weaknesses of employees? One of the things I often have struggled with is the HR professionals in organizations. And I've got friends that are in the security space in some really big companies, and I often find it's the security folks that understand the risks and actually are picking up on the warning behaviors, and they're actually quite good at it. But then there's often a mismatch between our security folks and our HR people, and that can create divisions, and we don't always see results. But I'm really curious, Belinda, on your thoughts and observations around that.
Uh, well, that's a little bit of a hobby horse for me. Look, HR professionals, have a huge responsibility. They are the custodians of people, and I do think at times, I have the privilege of working with wonderful HR professionals. Um, but I think in the wider world of HR, there can be, and there has been good evidence to support what I'm about to say, which is there can be an unthinkingness there can be an inclination to follow the fad rather than the facts. And what I would encourage all HR professionals to do is to stop and really think about, what does my organization need? What does this system need? As opposed to following what as I said, might be the latest fad. And I think, to anchor it back into your point, if you can do just one thing, then shift the dial from being reactive to proactive with data. So early screening, we know, in almost every situation that you can think of, be it organizational, be it medical, be it engineering, be it architect, it doesn't matter what it is, data-driven early interventions save lives, bring better results, and give us the data we need to have really constructive, proactive, better outcomes. And I think that I would therefore go back to your point. If I could do just one thing, I would make sure that I'm making data-driven decisions that allow us to move away from being reactive in the event of there being a crisis, to having data that we can actually use to proactively manage these capabilities in our population, and then stop and do a bit of an audit, because you can't eat the elephant. So do an audit and think about, well, what do we have in place? And most organizations will have some things that they can start drawing on. And then it's just about building on that and building on the data so that you're really creating both an environment that is going to be more psychologically safe, an environment that is going to enable people to really thrive, and you're also helping develop people that have scope for developing, and in a way helps them be better citizens, if we tie it back to being a good citizen, in terms of the behaviours at work.
Yeah, as you're saying that, it was really interesting, because it struck me about the similarities between the approach that you're recommending and really the public health type of initiative that people have been trying to develop around fixated and grievance-fueled violence, particularly fixated threat assessment centres, etc. So, that is around looking at levels of concern, which could be akin to our screening. So we're doing an assessment on the person. We're looking at the level of concern. If they are of moderate level or above, then there is a response, whether it's intervention, support, wraparound support, whatever it might be, to then try and manage that level of concern and ultimately keep the person away from offending. So, we don't know who will be the person that will have gone on to carry out violence, because everyone gets that response. Like as you said, sort of in the medical space, we have someone that's at risk of heart disease. They get prescribed exercise, maybe blood thinners, cholesterol lowering medications, go and do meditation to reduce your stress. So there is a response put in place. Now, we may not know whether that was the person that was going to go on and have a heart attack, but hopefully by a wraparound, well-rounded approach, we capture the person without needing to be, pinpointing our prediction. And really what you're saying is we're not pinpointing who the problematic person is. We're saying that this person has these types of tendencies, they could be a risk, and therefore we need to have a response and a management plan in place to make sure that we capture and service this individual and then bring them into our organisation.
It's a good summary, Nathan. We couldn't do it better.
So, Kate,
Exactly.
I mean, in saying all of that, and I guess thinking about the research in the future, I mean, obviously we've learnt a lot about personality traits in the workplace. Where do you see the I guess the current gaps still existing, and are there things that we still need to be looking at and investigating in this area?
Yeah, I like the point that you made earlier about the culture of the organization. And I think that is one of the areas that we could probably look further into, because we know that behavior occurs in a context, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. And something that might be a problem in one particular context isn't necessarily a problem in a different one. So what we do want to look at is the interaction between the person, their behavior, what risks do they actually pose, but how would those risks be operationalized and how would they necessarily manifest themselves in the particular organization that they're working for? And maybe a better fit for them would be, a different sort of company or a different sort of line of work. So those kind of interactions haven't really been looked at particularly deeply. And I think that would allow us to work with the companies a lot more effectively, because we wouldn't just be putting in management strategies for the individual teams, but perhaps more holistically for the organization itself.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, wonderful. Well, that might be a perfect note to finish on. Belinda, where can people find out more about the Derailer's Profiler?
I think the best thing would be to come to our website, to PeopleWise, which is an LCAP company now. So we're part of the LCAP group. And if you go to www.peoplewise.co.uk, you can certainly find it there. And of course, you can also email me. That's certainly something that would come through to me. So would be delighted with any inquiries. I think it's a growing area. I think it's one that's only going to continue to challenge organizations as they look to grow, but also as a top and bottom line, look to obviously save costs. And I would go back to the point that I think in this particular area, because we're not looking at strengths, we're looking at potential derailing behaviors. I believe that one of the first shifts that has to happen is that organizations redefine these behaviors as not as a personality challenge, but as an operational risk. And in doing so, everything can flow from that, including from being reactive to being proactive, and doing a bit of an audit to see what you've already got in there to manage that risk register.
Great. All right. And Kate, where can people stay up to date with your research?
Well, we're just about to launch a new research project. So on the condensed version of the tool. So people are welcome to contact me as well by email. And it's certainly, if people are interested in finding out more about the research, then they can do that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, and a shout out or an appeal to organisations out there that
Exactly.
that may be interested in
In the research.
potentially getting some access to the tool and and being involved in the data collection would be wonderful.
That would be brilliant. And
Yeah,
do get into Kate or myself as we start to build out the data pool. Brilliant.
wonderful. Kate, do you have an email that's best for people to reach you on?
Yeah, just kate.fritzon@acap.edu.au.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, look, I really enjoyed the conversation with you both. I mean, it's a slightly different topic to what we normally cover, but again, insider threat, it's often the thing we don't always hear about until it's too late. So it's been wonderful to talk to you both, and I appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much, Nathan.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Thanks so much, Kate.
Thank you for listening to the Targeted Violence podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please support the show by subscribing. Stay tuned for more episodes.